My new commercial property came with an unexpected tenant, a widow, a wooden plank, and 11 years of roses she had no legal right to grow. I want to preface this by saying that when I started writing this post, I thought I knew exactly what kind of story it was. A clear-cut property dispute. A man, a building, a trespasser. I had the narrative all figured out. I was wrong about almost everything. Background. My name is Daniel Ostrowski. I'm 38 years old, a commercial real estate developer based out of Columbus, Ohio, though I do deals across the Midwest and occasionally the East Coast. I've been doing this for 11 years, long enough to have made serious money, lost serious money, and developed what I thought was a fairly unsentimental approach to property. Buildings are assets. Land is inventory. Sentiment is the enemy of margin. In February of last year, I acquired a 3-story mixed-use commercial building on Clement Street in the Hilltop neighborhood, a district that had been quietly gentrifying for about 6 years, the kind of slow-burn neighborhood transformation that I specialize in identifying early. The building had been owned by the same family for decades, fallen into mild disrepair after the original owner died, and sat in probate limbo long enough that the heirs, 4 adult siblings scattered across 3 states, were simply exhausted by it and motivated to sell at a price that made sense for me. Purchase price: $847,000. Not cheap for Hilltop, but fair for the location and the bones of the building. My plan was straightforward: gut renovate the ground floor for a restaurant tenant, clean up the 2 upper floors for professional office space, and hold for 7 to 10 years while the neighborhood appreciated around me. I did my due diligence. I reviewed the title. I walked the building twice with my contractor, Pete Mrazek. I reviewed the survey. I had my attorney, Rachel Cho, flag any easements or encumbrances. Nobody mentioned the roof. To be fair to myself, the flat roof looked completely unremarkable in the listing photos. It appeared in exactly 2 images. One aerial shot showing a standard-issue EPDM rubber membrane, the kind you see on every commercial building in the Midwest, dusted with gravel and urban grime. Standard. Boring. Nothing to note. I closed on March 3rd. I took possession March 3rd. I visited the building on March 9th with Pete to begin scoping the renovation. We went through the interior methodically. 1st floor, 2nd floor, 3rd floor, rooftop access hatch in the 3rd floor hallway ceiling. Pete pulled down the folding ladder and went up first. He was quiet for a moment. "Mark," he said, using the nickname only he uses. "You're going to want to come up here." What I found. The roof of my building is approximately 2,400 square feet. When I climbed through that hatch on March 9th and stood up straight in the pale late winter sunlight, what I saw was not a gravel membrane. It was a garden. Not a few potted plants. Not a sad little container garden someone had abandoned. A garden. A real, deliberate, long-cultivated garden. Raised wooden planter beds, 12 of them, weathered gray with age, running in 2 rows down the center of the roof, each one filled with dark soil, dormant now in early March but clearly rich and tended. Climbing roses on a trellis system anchored to the parapet wall along the eastern edge. I would later learn there were 14 rose varieties, each one labeled with a small handwritten wooden stake. A section of ornamental grasses. A mature fig tree in an enormous ceramic pot that must have weighed 300 pounds. Stone pathways between the beds, made from irregular bluestone pavers. A weathered teak bench facing south. Solar-powered fairy lights strung between small wooden posts. A handmade sign, painted in careful script, read, Eleanor's Garden, ISTE 2013. I stood there for a long time. "There's a plank," Pete said, pointing. Along the eastern parapet wall, at the point closest to the adjacent building, a 6-story residential building called the Clement Arms, built in the 1960s, its brick face about 4 feet from mine. Someone had laid a wide wooden plank, like a gangplank, bridging the gap between the buildings at rooftop level. The Clement Arms was slightly taller than mine. From one of its upper floor windows, a person could step out and cross that plank and arrive on my roof. "How long has this been here?" I said. Pete crouched by one of the planter beds. "This wood is old. These beds have been here a long time." He picked up the fig tree's pot, or tried to. "This thing isn't going anywhere. Been here through multiple winters." I took photographs of everything. 63 photographs. I noted the structural condition of the planters, the irrigation system, a rudimentary drip setup fed by a rain barrel in the corner, the electrical situation, the fairy lights ran off a small solar panel bolted to my parapet wall. I noted the plank. I noted which window it connected to. Then I went down, called Rachel, and said, "We have a situation." The legal reality. Rachel's assessment was delivered the following day, and it was unambiguous. "This is trespass," she said. "Ongoing, deliberate, long-term trespass. It doesn't matter how long it's been happening or how pleasant the garden is. The previous owners apparently allowed it or never knew about it. I'll need to dig into that. But regardless, no easement was ever recorded, no license was ever granted in writing. You own that roof. Someone has been using it without authorization. You have every right to demand they remove their property and cease access immediately. What about adverse possession? I asked because I know enough real estate law to ask the right questions. Not applicable to a commercial property in Ohio under these circumstances, Rachel said. Adverse possession requires open, notorious, hostile, exclusive, and continuous use for 21 years in Ohio. 11 years doesn't get there. And the hostile element is complicated anyway. We'd win that argument easily. This is your roof, Daniel. Legally, this is simple. Simple, legally. I had Pete pull the property records on the Clement Arms. I got the contact information for the building manager. And then, because I do this in every deal, I simply asked around. I talked to the sandwich shop owner on the ground floor of the Clement Arms. I talked to the postal carrier on that route. I talked to a woman walking a dog outside. Within 48 hours, I knew who Eleanor was. Her name was Eleanor Marsh. She was 73 years old. She had lived in apartment 6C of the Clement Arms for 31 years, moved in when her husband Gerald was still alive, raised 2 kids there, watched the neighborhood change around her, outlived Gerald by 14 years. She was, by all accounts, a quiet, self-contained woman who kept to herself, tended her garden, occasionally brought zucchini and tomatoes to neighbors in the building, and spent most of her time reading or gardening or both. She had started the roof garden in 2013. She had apparently asked the previous owner of my building, a man named Vincent Kowalski, who was by that time elderly and disengaged and who died in 2019, for permission or something like permission. No one could tell me exactly what had been said. Vincent's children, who were the sellers, had no knowledge of any arrangement. It had simply continued, year after year, Eleanor crossing that plank with her watering can and her pruning shears, tending her garden on a roof she didn't own, on a building whose owner changed without her knowledge. I thought about this for several days before I did anything. The planning phase. Here is the part where the Reddit comments will tell me what kind of person I am, and I want to be precise about my thinking because it matters. I did not feel nothing. That is the truth. I'm a real estate developer, not a sociopath. I understood, with perfect clarity, what that garden represented to a 73-year-old widow living alone in a 6th-floor apartment. I understood what it meant to have built something with your hands over 11 years, to have carried soil up to a roof, to have coaxed a fig tree through Ohio winters, to have painted a sign with your name on it. I understood all of that. I also owned the roof. I paid $847,000 for the building the roof is attached to. My renovation plan requires full access to that roof. I need to replace the EPDM membrane, which, Pete informed me, was showing its age in several spots and would need to be addressed within 2 years regardless. I had a restaurant tenant interested in the ground floor who had expressed interest in a rooftop terrace as a future phase. I have investors in this deal who expect returns. So here was my actual situation. I had a legal right that was clear. I had a human situation that was complicated. And I had to decide how to handle it in a way I could live with. I spent 2 weeks in planning. Not just about what to do about Eleanor, about the whole situation. I pulled the full permit history on the building. I had Pete do a detailed assessment of the roof's structural capacity. I had Rachel draft a formal notice of trespass, dated and ready, but I told her to hold it. I talked to 2 colleagues in the development business. One said just send the notice, it's business. The other said find a way to make it work for both of you if you can. And then I did something that surprised even me. I went to knock on Eleanor Marsh's door. Update 1. The first meeting. April 2nd. A Tuesday afternoon. I took the elevator to the 6th floor of the Clement Arms and knocked on the door of apartment 6C. She answered after a moment. Eleanor Marsh was a small woman, 5'2", maybe, with silver hair cut practically short and the kind of eyes that assessed you with complete calm the moment they landed on you. She was wearing gardening gloves, which she was in the process of removing when she opened the door. She smelled faintly of earth and something floral. "Mrs. Marsh," I said. "My name is Daniel Ostrowski. I'm the new owner of the building next door. I'd like to talk to you about the roof, if you have a few minutes." She looked at me for a long moment. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't hostile. She was simply reading me, the way people who have lived a long time learn to read people quickly. "I wondered when you'd come," she said. "Come in." Her apartment was immaculate and full of plants. Of course it was. Every windowsill, every shelf, a controlled riot of green. She made tea without asking if I wanted any, and we sat at her kitchen table, and she told me, without drama and without self-pity, the whole story. Vincent Kowalski had told her she could use the roof. Not in writing. He had waved off the idea of paperwork, the way old men of his generation waved off paperwork, but clearly and directly. Use it, enjoy it, just don't fall off, was what he had apparently said. She had taken him at his word. She had invested 11 years and, she told me this matter-of-factly, without any apparent expectation that it would change anything, several $1,000s of her fixed income into that garden. I know it's yours now, she said. I'm not foolish. I know what the law says. What do you want? I asked her. Not as a negotiating tactic. I genuinely wanted to know. She looked at me steadily. I want to keep my garden. I know I probably can't. But that's what I want. I drove home and I sat with that for a long time. Update 2. The plan takes shape. Here is what I knew after that meeting. I knew Eleanor wasn't going to fight me. She couldn't afford to, and she seemed to know it. I knew I had every legal right to send that notice and begin clearing the roof. I knew my renovation timeline wanted the roof cleared by June 1st at the latest. I also knew something else, which was this. I am going to own this building for 7 to 10 years. The neighborhood knows Eleanor Marsh. The Clement Arms knows Eleanor Marsh. The sandwich shop owner called her Miss Eleanor with genuine warmth. The postal carrier had mentioned her by name without being asked. In this city, in this neighborhood, I am a newcomer. She has been here for 31 years. How I treated this situation was going to say something about who I was in this neighborhood. And I had a renovation to do that required city permits and neighborhood cooperation and goodwill from adjacent property owners. The Clement Arms management would need to coordinate with me on several aspects of the project. These things matter. But I want to be honest. Beyond the strategic considerations, something in me simply didn't want to be the person who dismantled an old woman's garden without at least trying to find another way. I called Rachel. Hold the trespass notice. I want to explore an alternative structure. Then I called Pete. I need you to pull out the structural report on the roof and tell me what weight load is feasible in a permanent fixture scenario, specifically along the eastern parapet wall. And I need you to price out what a proper rooftop terrace would look like as a Phase 2 addition. And then I called my restaurant tenant prospect, a chef named Adrian Kowalski, no relation to Vincent, who had been in discussions with me about the ground floor. Adrian had mentioned a rooftop terrace in passing, as a future dream element. I asked him to coffee. Update 3. The proposal. Over the following 3 weeks, I built something. Pete's structural report came back favorable. The roof could handle substantial permanent load with modest reinforcement. Adrian, over 2 coffees and 1 lunch, turned from a vague dreamer about a rooftop terrace into an active enthusiast. He had run restaurants for 14 years. He understood that a functioning rooftop kitchen garden, a real one, with roses and figs and heritage vegetables, established and mature, with an 11-year-old story, was not a liability. It was an asset. A genuine, remarkable, differentiating asset in a city full of restaurants that trucked in their herbs from a warehouse in Indiana. I had Rachel draft a formal license agreement. Not an easement, a revocable annual license, renewable at my discretion, with clearly defined terms. I had an insurance specialist review the liability structure. I had Pete price out the modifications needed to make the roof access safe and legal. Proper egress door instead of the hatch, safety railings along the parapet, removal of the plank, which was going regardless. On April 28th, I went back to apartment 6C with a folder and 2 cups of coffee from the place on the corner. Eleanor opened the door and looked at the folder. That looks like either good news or very well-organized bad news, she said. I'd like to think it's good news, I said. Can I come in? I laid it out for her at her kitchen table, as plainly as I could. Here is what I was proposing. Eleanor would be granted a formal, legal, annual license to use a designated section of the rooftop, approximately 1,400 square feet, encompassing her existing garden footprint. The license would be renewable each January, at my discretion, for as long as she lived in the Clement Arms and as long as certain conditions were met. Her existing planters, her fig tree, her roses, her bench, all of it would remain. We would build her a proper door. Safety railings. A better irrigation hookup. Lighting that wasn't jury-rigged to my parapet wall. In exchange, she would be formally acknowledged as the garden's founding cultivator in all materials related to Adrian's restaurant. She would participate, on terms she was comfortable with, in occasional events, not as an employee or vendor, but as what she actually was, the woman who built the garden. A consulting relationship, compensated at $200 per month, a small number, but one she could receive without tax complication, and one that acknowledged the reality that she had created something of value. She would sign an agreement acknowledging that the license was revocable, that the property was mine, and that if I needed to terminate for renovation or sale, she would receive 12 months' notice. She read every page. It took a long time. She asked 3 questions, all of them sharp and specific. I answered them. Then she looked up at me. "Why?" she said. "Because it's the right structure," I said, which was true. "And because you built something real, and I'd rather build on it than tear it down." She was quiet for a moment. "Gerald would have liked you," she said. "He had no patience for unnecessary cruelty either." She signed on May 3rd. Rachel filed the license. Pete began the rooftop modifications on May 15th. Update 4. The renovation and the complications. I want to tell you the rest of the story was smooth, because I built a nice narrative architecture and smooth would fit neatly into it. It was not smooth. 2 things happened in June that tested the whole arrangement. First, the building inspector who came to review Pete's rooftop egress door modification was, to put it diplomatically, a man with an agenda. His name was Carl Weston, and he had apparently had a difficult history with Pete's contracting firm on a previous project. The details were murky and I didn't fully investigate them, but the practical result was that he flagged 7 items on the inspection report, 3 of which were substantive and 4 of which Pete described to me in a terse phone call as pure harassment. This delayed the egress door installation by 6 weeks and cost me approximately $14,000 in additional work and reinspection fees. This was irritating. I dealt with it through Rachel, who wrote a careful, well-documented appeal letter to the city's building department. 2 of the harassment items were reversed on appeal. The other 2 we simply fixed to the letter of the code, which was the cleanest solution. Pete was frustrated. I was frustrated. We moved forward. Second, and more personal, in mid-June, I received a letter from an attorney representing 3 investors in the Clement Arms building, minority ownership stakeholders who had apparently gotten wind of the license arrangement and decided that Eleanor's decades of rooftop access had created some kind of implied easement that ran with their property's interests. The letter was fishing, speculative, and legally thin, but it was a letter, and letters from attorneys require responses. Rachel read it and described it as a nuisance claim from people who smelled a payday. She responded firmly and thoroughly, citing the specific Ohio adverse possession statute, the lack of any recorded encumbrance, and the fact that we had proactively resolved the trespass situation through a proper legal instrument. We heard nothing further. The letter had been a test to see if we'd settle quickly. We didn't. Eleanor, for her part, was unaware of most of this machinery. She was gardening. She crossed to the roof through her new door, which Pete had built with a small landing and proper steps, solid work, and she tended her plants through June and into July, when the roses came in. I visited the roof on a Saturday in late July, not to inspect anything, just because I wanted to see it in full summer. What I saw was extraordinary. The roses along the eastern parapet were in full bloom, deep reds, pale pinks, one extraordinary variety of creamy white with pink edges that Eleanor told me was called a heritage rose, a David Austin variety, and had taken her 4 years to coax into its current size. The fig tree had leafed out enormous and dark green. The raised beds were full of tomatoes, basil, climbing beans, zucchini with their yellow flowers, 3 kinds of lettuce. The bluestone paths were warm under the afternoon sun. Eleanor was on her bench with a book. She looked up when I came through the door and nodded, the way people nod when they're not particularly surprised to see you and don't feel the need to perform welcome. I sat on an overturned pot for a while and we talked, not about the license or the building or Adrian's restaurant, which was still months from opening. We talked about the neighborhood. She told me about Clement Street 20 years ago, 30 years ago. She knew this block the way only people who have stayed in one place for decades can know it. I took notes, not literally but mentally. She was a resource I hadn't expected to have. "You know what Vincent used to say about this roof?" she said at one point. "What?" "He said it was the best view in the neighborhood because nobody who hadn't earned it could see it." She looked out over the roofline. "I always thought he meant it philosophically." Update 5. The opening, and what came after. Adrian Kowalski's restaurant opened on November 14th. He called it Clement, which I thought was right. Simple, direct, rooted in the place. The menu featured, among other things, a rose petal vinegar made from Eleanor's heritage roses. A fig preserves served with a cheese course, from her fig tree. Fresh herbs from the roof garden cut same day. On the menu, in small type at the bottom of the back page, Rooftop Garden established 2013 by Eleanor Marsh. The Columbus Food Press covered it. One reviewer called the garden the restaurant's secret history made edible. The Dispatch ran a piece in the weekend magazine about urban rooftop gardens and used Eleanor as the central figure, with photographs of her among her roses. She was characteristically unsentimental about the attention. "I've been gardening up there for 11 years and no one cared until there was a restaurant attached," she said, which was fair, but she showed me the article clipping when I next saw her, which told me something. The restaurant has been full since it opened. Adrian has a waitlist for Friday and Saturday nights through February. My ground floor tenant is successful and paying premium rent and anchoring the building's value in exactly the way I planned. The office spaces on the second and third floors leased to a physical therapy practice and a small architecture firm, both of whom were drawn partly by the building's renovation quality and partly, I think, by the story of the place, which had by then acquired a modest local notoriety. Current estimated building value, approximately $1.4 million, based on a broker opinion I requested in December. That's an increase of over $500,000 in under a year, which is ahead of my most optimistic projection. A functioning rooftop garden with a documented history and an active restaurant partnership is, it turns out, a meaningful value driver. Eleanor renewed her license in January. She delivered, along with the signed renewal form, a small jar of rose hip jam with my name written on the lid in her careful script. I ate it on toast and it was very good. Reflection. What this story is actually about. I've been sitting here trying to figure out what the moral is, because Reddit posts like this are supposed to have morals, and I have a professional habit of deriving lessons from outcomes. Here is what I keep coming back to. I could have sent the trespass notice on March 11th. It would have been legal and fast and clean. Eleanor would have had no real recourse. The garden would have been removed by May, the roof would have been a blank slate, and I would have designed whatever terrace layout made the most sense for the restaurant concept I was planning. It would have been fine. It would have been a good renovation regardless. What I gained by not doing that was this: a rooftop with 11 years of horticultural history embedded in it, a story that a good chef turned into a meaningful restaurant concept, a neighborhood relationship that has opened doors for me in ways I'm still discovering, and, I'll say this plainly, the knowledge that I handled a situation with some decency when I didn't have to. What did I lose? Some efficiency. Some clean simplicity. 6 weeks of delay from Carl Weston's inspection nonsense, which had nothing to do with Eleanor and would have happened on any project. A renovation that became slightly more complicated in its planning phase. There are people in my industry who would say I was soft. That sentiment is the enemy of margin. That you don't get emotional about property. Here is my response to that. I am not sentimental about property. I am strategic about it. And the strategy here, which I worked out over 2 careful weeks with full information, was that the garden was more valuable intact than dismantled. Eleanor was more valuable as a partner than as an adversary. The story of what this building was more valuable than a blank slate. That is not sentiment. That is underwriting. But, and I want to be honest here, because I've been honest about everything else, it wasn't only underwriting. There was a moment, sitting in Eleanor Marsh's plant-crowded kitchen with the tea she made without asking, listening to her tell me about coaxing a fig tree through Ohio winters because her husband Gerald had loved figs and she wanted something of him still growing. There was a moment where the spreadsheet was not what I was thinking about. I was thinking about what it means to tend something for 11 years. To carry soil to a roof. To paint a sign with your name on it and plant roses from a catalog and make something beautiful in a place where nobody was looking. I was thinking that there are forms of ownership that don't appear on any title. And that the wisest thing, sometimes, is to recognize what already belongs to a place before you decide what to build there. TLDR, bought a commercial building, found an old woman's 11-year rooftop garden accessed by plank from her apartment window. Trespass, legally simple. Worked out a license agreement and a restaurant partnership instead. Building doubled in value. She renewed the license in January and brought me rose hip jam. Edit, to everyone asking about the plank, yes, it's gone. There's a real door now. A good one. Pete built it right. Edit 2. Eleanor says she doesn't use Reddit. She said, I'm 73, not unconscious, when I tried to explain what Reddit was. So your comments are safe.